And we are live. Ooh, goodness. Amazing what can happen when you press the wrong button. We are live and welcome. Today on the World Anvil World Building podcast live, we are talking world building factions. And goodness, do I have a guest for you. Welcome, Martha Wells. It is an absolute honor having you here today.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here.
It is wonderful. And factions, are you a fan of factions, would you say?
Oh, a lot. Yeah, I think that's most of what I write.
They show up in a lot of what you wrote, don't they? A lot of your stuff is about sort of faction on faction kind of conflicts.
Yeah, I think one thing I noticed with either beginning writers or sometimes really fan fiction written by really young people is it's all or nothing. It's either when somebody's completely good or completely bad, and it's just it doesn't really sit right with me. I don't know how much to describe it. It's just that's not how things work. And
Yeah, absolutely.
and the idea of an antagonist in fiction is really important. I think the antagonist who is not the villain.
Yeah, absolutely. And factions can really slot into that very, very nicely as a kind of role.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just looking through my list on like my library thing, and how many of the books I was realizing do deal with factions in one way or another.
Yeah, I think it's a very sci-fi fantasy thing when we're to kind of set up as part of the world. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me introduce my fantastic guest, who really knows, introduction, because of course she's far too modest to introduce herself. Martha Wells has been a sci-fi fantasy writer since her first fantasy novel was published in 1993, and her work includes the books of Rexora series, the Ilrian series, the Murderbot Diaries series, more on that later, and most recently Witch King for Tor.com. She has also written media tie-in fiction for Star Wars, Stargate Atlantis, and Magic the Gathering, some of my favorite IPs there, as well as a short fiction, YA novels, and non-fiction too. Okay, I need a big breath for this next section. She has won Nebula Awards, Hugo Awards, Locus Awards, an Alex Award, and a Dragon Award. And her work has appeared in the World Fantasy Award ballot, the Philip K. Dick Award ballot, the BSFA Award ballot, the USA Today bestseller list, the Sunday Times bestseller list, and the New York Times bestseller list. She is a member of the Texas Literary Hall of Fame, as you would imagine, having heard that biography. And her books have been published in 30 languages. And if that was not enough, she is also a consulting producer on the Murderbot series for Apple TV. Can you tell us just a tiny soupçon or something about the Murderbot series?
Well, it's actually in post-production now, and it should be airing sometime on Apple Plus in the summer.
Oh my goodness.
So not that far away.
I am very, very hyped for this. I'm hoping that we have time to get a little bit onto the role that you've taken there, just at the end. But we must, of course, start with our factions talk, and let's start with examples, because I feel like the best way to start a conversation is to know what we're talking about, and a good way to know what we're talking about with factions is examples. Do you have any favorites or sort of particularly well-known illustrative examples?
I was thinking of Farscape, how a large part of that series was kind of one of Jim Henson's kind of fundamental things he liked to write about, which was different groups of people that have the same purpose gradually coming together, but that don't get along, gradually coming together and existing together, which also can be said for Fraggle Rock too. But in Farscape, I think more people have seen the way the crew is at first divided against each other and not trusting each other, and basically over the whole first season it's them learning to be one group instead of a bunch of different people with a bunch of different agendas. And sometimes it goes past we have characters that take a few seasons to get into that. And you can also see it, I think that's more of an example of personal factions, because it becomes a found family series, of course, but it doesn't start out that way, which I think is really interesting, and it might actually have put off some people from the first season, because they made that conflict really real between the characters. And in the greater world, the political climate, you see different factions, even among the peacekeepers and Scorpius and all those other characters, just political factions about everybody's kind of pulling in a different direction. So I think that's a really good example of it.
It's funny that you mentioned Henson. I was actually the author of the Dark Crystal RPG, and in that, of course, you have the different the factions of the Gelflings, and then of course you have the Skeksis faction, and within the Skeksis, there's also various kind of interesting kind of subgroups going on as well. I think it's really a mark of Henson's work in many ways that he does that.
Oh yeah, he's real interesting to look at, because there's always that. I think it was Frank Oz that said, I'm not sure if it was who it was, it might have been him, who said that Jim Henson came in to work one day and said, we're gonna do a TV show that's going to bring peace to the world. And it's like, yeah, that's a great ambition. Yeah.
That's really beautiful. I think speaking of recent movies, Dune is a fantastic example of a world that's built on factions and parallel factions and competing factions and all of those kinds of things, and lots of different kind of people doing different kind of things in a very big world.
Yeah, and it's and it just shows how, like, the towards the beginning of the first book, the way the Atreides family,
Yeah.
Is basically just almost destroyed because of the factionalized pulling them apart in their own family and their own people, and then of course the faction in the Empire coming after them.
Yeah.
In a recent book series, Kate Elliott has done the first 2 books of a trilogy. Basically, of course, now the name's gone quite out of my head, but it's a far future space opera based on kind of Alexander the Great and the Persian War, and except the main character is female, and it's her group of companions based loosely again on Alexander the Great. And in the first book, it's her fighting to take her place as basically an heir to their empire, and all the factionalized infighting between the different military groups and military commanders, and the people who are supporting her mother, the emperor, and people who are not, and so forth. And then you see a lot of the other side where the same thing is going on with them. And that's a really, really good example of it. And it's a really good book too. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, drawing from your own writing list, you've written for Star Wars. Star Wars is another example of these kind of there are so many factions in Star Wars. Once you start to think about, every planet has a faction, and there are sub factions, and there's the Jedi and the Sith, of course, but then there's all the kind of gangs and stuff, and
the criminal, the rise of the whole disruption in the political structure has caused the rise of all these criminal gangs. And
it's another kind of great example of so many different factions and different groups that want different things, which is kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about factions, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and Andor is a good example of that too.
Yes.
Which doesn't even get into the Jedi, just the origins of the rebellion, and how at one point they basically have to let one of their factions be killed and captured because to keep the rest of it from being discovered. It's they're doing that whole revolutionary thing where you operate in separate cells, separate groups that don't have a lot of connection with each other, just so if somebody gets caught, then the others will still be able to get away. But it's a really interesting show. It's very, I don't know, it feels the most sort of grounded and realistic, I think, of the Star Wars shows, even though I like Mandalorian and Book of Boba Fett and Ashoka and all those, but that one kind of feels really different.
Yeah, it's much more gritty and sort of low fantasy, I think. That's where it's sort of sits, low science fantasy for me.
Yeah, it takes out the sort of grand, noble um, striving, which I think is not really ever been a part of Star Wars, because for at least for me, it's kind of out there, but the whole Han, Luke, and Obi-Wan Kenobi at that point, that group, and Leia, of basically come across as a very tiny group of people that's trying to just survive through that first movie. And I think Andor goes back to that a little bit, the really personal aspect of Star Wars.
Yeah, it's very much a story about people that have been thrown into events rather than the big events themselves.
Yeah. That's a better way to say what I was trying to say.
I think actually we've touched on this already, but what are the different roles that factions can take in our stories? You already mentioned, factions and characters. It's a thing you have to balance, because at the end of the day, we as readers or as players, we connect with people. But those factions give a larger structure to our stories, and they can give a sense of breadth to our world. So what are the kind of different ways that factions can show up in those kinds of narratives?
Well, like the way I did it in Witch King, in the present day section, what you see is the conflict between the different factions, who are in a way all on the same page, because they've all wanted to basically create this world free of the hierarchs. But now the idea of how to govern it starting to, people are starting to have different ideas about that. And so you see different groups that are really pulling together to accomplish a goal, but want to do it in different ways. And you're also seeing groups that are trying to take power back, and not really thinking about the good of the whole. So conflict is really important in fiction. And I know people talk about cozies, and actually in about a week or so, I'm doing a panel with T. Kingfisher and Malka Older and KJ Charles about comfort. It's our comfort panel. I think this is the third or fourth time we've done it. And one of the things we talk about is how even cozy and books that are considered comfort fiction need conflict or have conflict. And and what makes it cozy or comforting is really to the individual. And sometimes it's just cozy to read a story that you've read before, even if it's a very violent story with all these things happening. It's still it ends the way you like, and you know what that's going to be. And so, but that conflict, I think, is driven by factions in so many different stories. And conflict can be very small. The conflict can be, trying to get your coffee shop set up and you can't get coffee or whatever. But that's still a conflict. And the factionalized stuff is, I think, again, you're not looking at the giant epic scope of good versus evil. In some ways, what you're looking at is individual people and how they relate to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of my favorite uses of factions, just personally, is faction as origin. So when you look at The Witcher, for example, who is he? He's the Witcher. What does that mean? He's part of the Witchers. That's kind of what that means in a nutshell. Like, yes, it is a role in himself. He is a character in himself, but he's part of this wider thing. It's the same. It's the same for. I'm trying to think of other good examples because this has just come to me. People who are part of a secret society. James Bond. He's part of MI5, 6, one of those two. Yeah. It's sort of faction as origin. I always find that very fascinating. And funnily enough, it's something that's used a lot in sort of Dungeons and Dragons and other role-playing games as well. Choose your faction at the beginning because that tells you which equipment you have and various other things. But I always find that an intriguing trope. It's just a kind of personal preference.
Oh yeah, and it really helps, I think, when you're trying to build a character. I find when I first started trying to write, a long time ago when I was a kid, I guess I'd been reading a lot of books where the main character was isolated in some way, was out in the wilderness or lost on a planet or whatever. And that writing that really didn't work for me. And I think it was when I realized the way I like to build my characters is when they're how they relate to other characters. I kind of can't know who the person I'm creating is until I see how they react to other characters.
Yeah.
And characters who are supposed to be on their side, characters who aren't on their side, characters who are pretending to be on their side but not, and all this kind of that personal conflict is how you decide, or how you start making decisions for your character about what kind of person they are. And I think you can enlarge that to the scope of your world. It's like, who are the factions in your world and what do they want? What are they after?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've had factions as, antagonists and conflict. We've had factions as origin. I think factions as found family is the other thing that you sort of referred to a little
Yeah.
bit there. I really love that again as a trope, sort of, falling in with and then discovering that actually, this is your found family.
I had a real interesting panel, I think at Worldcon. They all blur together. Time is meaningless. Yeah. Um, uh, this past year about found family, and someone had mentioned that found family takes on almost the image of the Western nuclear family with the mom and the dad. So one person's the mom and one's the dad. And I was thinking that hasn't been my experience in reality, because I had traveled there with basically my found family, my husband and several of our friends, and it was a long trip and very fraught through these different airports trying to figure out what we were doing. And it was interesting to see how the leadership of the group shifted to the person who was most awake and most able to handle it at that time. And there was no like established role. It was just like everybody was kind of taking care of each other, and then the leadership shifting as one person realized what was going on and what we needed to do.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was probably more realistic, as it's not falling into because the whole thing of a benefit of a found family is it does not take on the shape of the family structure your culture has tried to impose. It can be whatever you want.
Yeah.
And okay, now I've got roles different. I had to look at the question. Roles different, factions can take in our stories. But yeah, that's a found family can be a faction like that too. And then there can be factional infighting within found families that are about not necessarily, again, the good and evil thing, but when somebody thinks the agenda should change, is what they're doing should change, and there's conflict between individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've discussed that factions can take on all of these different roles. We've shared a lot of examples. I think it's time to get into methodologies. So when you're sitting in your dream room and thinking about your world and your characters and what you're going to write, how do you approach creating factions? Like how does that come for you?
Well, the way I world build is basically the characters and the world come together at the same time for me, because the world has to be a place that would create these characters, and the characters have to be people that would live in this world. So kind of all comes together. But kind of one of the first things I look for is points of conflict. Oh, excuse me. So you start looking for points of conflict. It's like, what does this character want? Okay, for example, in the books of the Raxura, when Moon is brought to the court of Indigo Cloud for the first time, and that causes a disruption in the way the court already functions because of who he will be to the court if he's able to stay there. And you see all these different factions based around the two factions, each based around one of the queens, everything kind of shifting. And that gives you all so much potential, even if I didn't sit out and plan it, but because my plan basically went, Stone will find Moon and Moon will be taken to this court. And then hopefully more story will happen at that point. And then when we get there, you think about, what's this going to do to this group already? This is going to cause so much conflict in these other factions of people who have taken on the role of consort and are now going to lose it because a real consort is here. And so that, again, it helps you develop these characters. Who's going to be upset by this? Who's actually going to be okay with it because they didn't particularly like their role that they've been forced into in the first place? Who's going to be supportive, and who, because of that's their job, and who's going to be supportive because they form bonds, and all that kind of stuff just basically explodes outward from that act of bringing this person into this other society. And it helps you figure out the society, because you come up with like, oh, it would be really cool if this happened. What would we need for that to happen? We need this, this, and this. And so again, it helps you. That's how you build a world organically, basically, based on what you've already set up and what you want to do.
That's fascinating. What kind of inspirations do you use when you're creating these factions? Like, are there particular, do you like to rely on history? Do you like to, rely on things you've read or seen and take inspiration from that?
Well, I've done, I've done so much reading. I think it's really different, things like research and stuff like that. I know at my age, I'm 60 and I've been writing for more than 30 years, or publishing for more than 30 years. I've been writing for basically probably 50 years, starting with like scrawling with crayons on stuff. So I've kind of absorbed so much information at this point, and in ways that stories play out, and also just reading history and watching TV, and the way that factions in human society are so ingrained, almost into our DNA. It would almost be stranger to try to imagine societies without real factions. I think even when people try to do the very simplistic good versus evil, you'll still see factions creep in there, because it's just such a part of our sort of social conditioning as humans.
Yeah, absolutely. Groups of people. It's kind of what we default into.
Yeah. I mean, we start learning it on the playground when we started first attacking each other for having different color hair or something. It's like, that's when you learn factions in them, and I think it's hard to it's hard to kind of step away from that.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, if you read history, a lot of history of factions reads like playground conflict. Like, obviously
Yeah.
with kings, but if you look at some of the stuff that, King of France was saying to the King of England and vice versa, it reads like playground conflict. It's not a bad place to look for inspiration.
And then other people below the kings jockeying for power. And a lot of it is that, and greed. Jockeying for power, they talk about how power corrupts pretty much endlessly, and it certainly does. And greed, and that wonderful combination of greed and stupidity in quest for power.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness. We're not going to talk about current politics.
Yeah.
Let's talk about common mistakes when world building factions. I think we've touched on a couple of things already, but I think it's really useful to dig into. I'm not going to ask you to name any names. I'm not going to get shady, but I think it's useful to talk about, the things that can go wrong and how to stop that happening. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think one of the basic things that goes wrong with setting up an antagonist is trying to come up with it, not being able to see from the antagonist's point of view. Like, there was a movie a long time ago. I don't know how many people watching now would have seen it. It was a Kevin Costner movie real early called Waterworld.
Oh,
And
yes.
God, I can't remember the name. He's a really good actor, played the bad guy basically, and they made him because it was really popular at that time to basically be like he was this out of control madman who was just doing these things because he was mad, and that was so popular at the time. And the thing that really struck me is everything that character did made perfect sense, because there's this huge struggle over resources, and he was trying to acquire resources for this large group that of his people that he had put together, and that was his power base, and he was trying to acquire resources for them. And it's like, there's nothing mad about that. I mean, that's a perfectly sensible thing to do. So they didn't have any reason to make the character like that except to show that he was bad. And it was so, I mean, that's so sketchy. I mean, there are so many problems with that you could go down a list of, for days basically. And it was so unnecessary, because a lot of, the really interesting conflicts are between two groups that are not that far apart in what they want, but they're going about it when it would make more sense to come up with agreements and share everything. It's like the two groups fight and end up, destroying everything. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, not seeing things from your, even if it's a bad guy, not seeing things from the other side's perspective. Like in Witch King, I don't show the perspective of the hierarchs, but we understand it's basically they're basically like an even worse version of a colonial power coming in, who's going to move in and just take this land. And actually, some of the things they do are based on real colonialism in, say, India and other places. Um, and so, from their perspective, that's fine. They're just doing what they should be doing. And the other people, the perspective of the people who's being done to is that these are horrible monsters, and kind of understanding that, and that something doesn't have to be a monster in the classic sense to be an antagonist.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to raise a common mistake, which is a lot more basic than that, and it's just about brand recognition. So if your reader is going, wait, who are these guys? They have an eye. Wait, didn't the other guys have an eye? What's with the eye? Who is this? And or their names all start with the same letter or something. If there are so many, and actually I will address this audience question now. If there are so many factions that the audience, whoever the audience is, cannot keep track, or they are so confusingly described or similarly described by accident that the audience cannot keep track, check yourself, check your world building, do some work, because the whole point of factions is that you kind of understand that there are different moving parts at play. And if you've confused the audience, then you have a little bit of work to do with brand recognition, naming, maybe slimming things down a little bit so there aren't quite so many factions at play right away. These are very kind of, beginner level mistakes, but they can really make or break something. If your audience is lost, then they're not enjoying it anymore. They've taken a step back and they're like, wait, who the hell are these guys? You never want your audience to be feeling that by accident.
Yeah. And that's a really good point. And particularly, I'd add that if you're bored with it, if it's boring you, it's going to bore them. So if you're adding so much detail and in describing what other people that aren't like important to the main thrust of your story are doing, then maybe they don't need to be in the book. And it's you don't, like, I think epic fantasy for a long time got painted as very Game of Thrones-ish, where you had to have all these different characters. You had to have, and all doing things that were all supposedly important or contributing somehow. And it's like, you really don't have to do that. if you go back further to Lord of the Rings, he doesn't really do that. You're concentrated on this core group of people, and then he adds other people as they need, when they get to Minas Tirith and all that. So that's not, fantasy is not defined by that. You know, you can have smaller groups. You can have, I don't think sword and sorcery is as popular now, but that was usually one or two, you know, very close people going on an adventure. That, and fantasy can be, especially nowadays, I think fantasy's broken free of its category problem, and where it was people like, tell this story about back in the 90s being on panels and being forced to on this panel, trying to define the difference between high fantasy and epic fantasy and, you know, noble fantasy and all these other like absolutely BS categories that were totally meaningless. And nowadays we get to see fantasy like N.K. Jemison's The Fifth Season, which is an epic fantasy, but it doesn't follow any of those tropes that we associate with epic fantasy, but we read it and we know it's still an epic fantasy because of its scale and everything. So your fantasy can be what you want. And I think that's one of the best things about how fantasy has evolved currently, especially with, we're starting to get a lot of different voices, more diverse authors who are writing all these different stories. And we're getting some, very slowly now, starting to get some works in translation that are really interesting. And so basically you can do whatever you want, and don't feel like bound to do something when you don't think it's working for your story, just because you think that's what a fantasy should have.
Yeah, absolutely. I've talked a lot about cultural monoliths when I talk about, you know, nations and countries and this kind of thing. It also applies to factions. Everything that is like, not everybody in your faction should feel exactly the same way about exactly the same thing. All of that, just like give people personalities. You know, George, who works for the church, should feel differently from Fred, who works for the church. And it could be the same church and they can have the same general beliefs, but they should have different personalities. You know, don't make little clones, I think is another one I've seen.
Oh, and a good recent example is the movie Conclave, which is on streaming now. And it's basically like a slightly near future, not strictly historical because the characters are made up, but the cardinals trying to choose the new pope. And it is, you will see prime examples of faction. You know, it's practically a textbook on how to show factions.
Wow.
And that's really interesting. And it also really shows you the different opinions and attitudes among people who are technically supposed to be thinking and doing the same thing.
Yeah, we haven't talked about, when we were talking about the role of factions within world building, that's another role. It's when a faction splinters, you know, what does that look like? You know, when tensions pull within a single faction, what does that look like? And that's another fascinating kind of story or subplot to write, I think.
Yeah, it's all just generators of conflict. You know, small scale conflict, large scale conflict. And again, it's like people, when you say conflict, people think, oh, a big war. And it doesn't always have to be a big war. You know, we all know big war, fantasy wars and science fiction wars are fun, but it can be, again, a really little personal conflict over something, you know, something tiny is just as gripping as a large scale one.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked a lot about mistakes. Let's talk about what a faction has to have. What, in your opinion, does it need to have to be a faction? What should we not forget?
Well, I think basically people who are in a faction don't always really think of themselves as a faction, and they don't, you know, call themselves a faction. So, and also factions can shift. People within factions can shift back and forth. Because we're talking about something that's pretty basic to human behavior. So I guess this sort of falls into common mistakes too, I guess a little bit. But the idea that someone once in the faction cannot be talked out of it.
Mm.
It's really hard to convince people of stuff. We've all seen the internet, but even true stuff with like science and PowerPoints and the whole bit. But that some people can change their minds. There's an interesting book by Neon Yang, that's Yang, called The Genesis of Misery, about basically a person who's kind of drawn into this religious war that they do not believe in, but as they go along in the plot and trying to fight and survive and things in this conflict, they are basically indoctrinated.
Oh.
And you see this person who was pretty independent first, is just drawn into this way of thinking. It's a science fiction novel with people in giant robot suits fighting in space, but it's also this really sort of intense look at how fanaticism affects people. And because you're seeing it from that character's point of view, it's like you're kind of wrapped up in it, and you're kind of going, when you get to that point, you're like, oh, are we the baddies? And it's one of those experiences. It's a really good book.
As an aside, I actually know Neon. We were at Milford together, and I will tell them that you recommended their book. They will be over the moon.
I love their work.
Yeah, they're great. They're also a really lovely human being.
Mm-hmm.
What else for you? What does a faction have to be a faction? I think there's something about agency for me that needs to be remembered with factions, I think.
Yeah, they're usually striving for a goal, and that goal might be to keep the status quo. It might be to change the status quo. It's but there's got to be something that's kind of holding them together on it. And that's generally a good way to, if you're trying to break up a faction, is one of the best ways to break up a faction that's trying to get to a goal is give them that goal. And then you see everyone come apart. Because again, there's nothing to hold that group together anymore. And it's kind of interesting to explore factions. You attain this goal, then what happens next? Are people still trying to hold on to power? And you get to see who just wants power and who actually just wanted, the goal to make things better. And so that's a really interesting thing to explore too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mentioned brand recognition before, but just again, as a kind of technical reader thing, I think it's always useful to include. It doesn't have to be a motto or a kind of like Game of Thrones style set of colors or something, but something to tell them apart is useful for your reader, for your player, for you to be able to say, they saw a such and such symbol and they knew ... Like it can be very, very helpful to have some kind of, visual cue or linguistic cue or something that clues a character into this is someone from that faction as opposed to from this faction, an identifier, as it were.
Oh yeah, that's a really good example of that is the Chinese and Korean and other Asian like martial arts and fantasy movies, where generally you have the sect or group and they have the color that defines them. Because usually in those, especially those shows are often like, 40, 30, 40, 50 episodes, and you have a ton of people. Though even a lot of times it's the same group of extras playing all the different groups, but the fact that they're in these colors really helps you identify people.
Yeah, they're literally color coded for your convenience.
Yeah, color coded for your convenience. Yeah,
which is not a bad thing to do.
No,
but yeah, like something to help people, give them handles to hold on to as you guide them through your world.
And so many things do that. Star Trek does that, in more subtle ways. Just having on a TV show like that, excuse me, a TV show or movie, just having a specific look for each group of characters, even if it's not particularly color coded, but some way you can tell who they are.
Yeah. Yeah. I think another thing with factions that's interesting to consider, and different factions handle this differently, and of course there are exceptions, is how does a faction procreate, as it were? How does it make more of itself? Does it proselytize? Does it indoctrinate? Does it introduce? How does that bit work? Because if a faction is going on for any length of time, otherwise it's just gonna die out, depending
Yeah.
on the life cycle of your species that you're talking about. So I think that's one that people touch on often less, but I think it's a really important aspect, and it speaks a lot to attitude of a faction for me.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to play with factions that are kind of dying out because their goal has just become less and less important to people as it goes along.
Yeah. Small
Um,
Gods is a wonderful example of that by Terry Pratchett, where you have
oh
like
yeah,
the last priest of a god, and he's the only one that can hear the voice.
yeah, and it's kind of sad. And in Benaranovich is the Rivers of London when it
Mm,
first starts out. Um, the uh, the main character runs into the police officer who's basically the last wizard in the Metropolitan Police, and because everyone else died or left, and it's interesting to watch them trying to build back up, and that whole um, and the way they're kind of factionalized off from the other police. But yeah, that's just a really interesting. Um, um, how do you recruit
yeah.
when, especially when your needs for the to include the person are so specific, and you're also looking for people who aren't just like power mad wanting to, you know, become the bad guy, basically, whether
Yeah.
they know that or not.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think it's always an interesting question that I'm curious about. I mean, I'm a world
Yeah.
building nerd, but I always want to know how these things kind of self-perpetuate.
Yeah, I mean, we see them perpetuate in the modern world, but how is that going to apply to a fantasy or science fiction world where it's, your culture is very different, your means of communication are very different.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked on this a little bit, but I think it's really important. We see a lot of narratives that are good versus evil, the grey knights versus the white knights and all of this stuff. How do we ensure our factions are more nuanced, that they're not just caricatures of a good guys versus bad guys scenario to make our world building a bit more interesting?
Yeah, I think that's something a lot of people have dealt with over the years. You're in fiction because you see a lot of the person who is either on the good side or the bad side suddenly discovering that there's a middle ground there, and that's a very common story. I think if you're as a writer when you're trying to come up with this stuff, one thing to think about is it's a great place to root out your own stereotypes and biases and prejudices and bigotry and things like that. It's like looking at what you're visualizing as the bad guy can tell you more about yourself than it will the character you're creating, and just your assumptions. And fantasy and science fiction are interesting places to explore that. I wish I could remember who said this, but this was, like back in when I was writing or getting ready to write The Harbors of the Sun. And someone said, why do we depict fantasy cities as dirty with no drainage and people starving and lots of poverty? Why do we depict the basic fantasy city that way? Why do we visualize it that way? Why can't you have a fantasy city that's better than what we have? And I was like, I'm going to do a fantasy city with mass transportation and medical care, and it made it really cool. It was really cool to look at it that way. It was just like a little shift in viewpoint. And I think those things, I mean, you have to, I mean, you can say, well, think out of the box, which is really easy to say. But first, you have to figure out where your box is and kind of explore your biases. I think nowadays, most people who are trying to write science fiction fantasy have heard about the idea of trying to stay away from making your world a monoculture.
Yeah.
And which was originally, again, it was sort of that the idea of monocultures were sort of, you're trying to particularly in TV science fiction and fantasy, you're trying to like explain this group. You've got 30 seconds to a minute to do it in the middle of your action story. Monoculture is a great way to sort of get across what these characters are going to be like and what they're doing. But in books, we have an unlimited budget, and we have, hopefully a lot of time while we're writing them to really explore. And you can give the feel that your world is not a monoculture without having to go in a lot of detail. It's like, people don't need to have a description of every human culture on Earth to know that there's a bunch of them. There's ways that you can give that impression, because really, in a lot of ways, when you're telling a fantasy novel, a modern fantasy novel, the idea of going into this world building where every inch of the world is just not feasible for a lot of people. I think you have to look at it more as you have to give the feel that stuff is out there, you have to give the feel that the world does not have boundaries by simple things of not saying, well, this is the only thing in the world. I don't know how it reminds me of books I read when I was much younger that was always kind of annoying me, because it would say, well, this valley is the only inhabited valley in this world. And you're like, oh, okay, so now the rest of the world in your head is just this big blank expanse, except for here, and nothing's going to come in. It immediately closes off so many possibilities. Yeah. And I think one of the keys to not having a monoculture is not closing off possibilities, not making blanket statements, and just by quick references, letting your reader know there are different factions out there, there are different groups out there, there are different cultures out there. And you can do that just by having a character walk through a market and describe what's there. Oh, this came from this came from that. I mean, there's lots of little ways to do it that don't interrupt the flow of the story.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you touched on something earlier, which is very, very relevant for this, which is essentially you can have different factions that are trying to achieve the same thing or almost the same thing, and they just have different methodologies, or they have different reasons that they want to achieve it. And that's a very nice way to break away from the kind of like one faction versus another faction in the good versus evil fight.
Yeah, that they just want to do the same thing, but they want to do it in a different way. And that's very, very common. And sometimes people can learn to agree, and sometimes they can't.
Yeah, exactly.
You can destroy a whole society by two groups that want to do the same thing, but in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. Or two groups that both have the best intentions at heart, but they both think that something else is the best outcome,
Yeah. And there's not all the factors they're not considering. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of this comes down to, of course, belief and faith as well, not just religious belief, but all sorts of different beliefs and faiths.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I think we could talk about factions together forever, but we must not. Let us touch on this. How complex and deep should your factions be?
I think just complex and deep enough to tell the story, because basically all the world building, everything should be in service to telling the story. And sometimes that story is basically the inner story of your character. So it doesn't have to be a big, plot heavy mystery or adventure or whatever. It can just be the story of your character trying to get from point A to point B, or trying to make a decision, or that's all those things are stories. But that story you're trying to tell should be the priority.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess you can always dig more later. Like if you need more for later books, you can add more stuff.
Yeah. Again, that's another thing about not creating boundaries and closing off your possibilities, is if you want to write more in this world, you've left the avenues out there.
Yeah, absolutely. The inimitable Andy Law once told me, my best tip for world building is leave yourself space to grow. And I think that's a very applicable one here.
Yeah, Warren Spector said that too,
Mm.
and on a panel I was there. I can't talk anymore. A panel I was on, he said that too, and yeah, and I think it's even more important for gaming, where the idea is the world will expand at points, and continue, than it is for novels.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially if you're going to be working on a universe with more people than just yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, speaking of more things to be written, you have a lot coming out soon,
Yeah.
right? Like, just like I have a list, guys. The Emily Adventures. Can you give us a taste of the Emily Adventures? How would you describe it in a nutshell?
It's a young adult story set in kind of a steampunkish world, about a girl who gets accidentally kind of taken along on an expedition to look for um, the hollow world underneath the surface of their own world. And then there's a second book that follows that where they're going. It's Emily in the Sky World. And I wrote them quite a while ago, and it was for a publishing line that went out that ended and went out of print. So they haven't been seen in quite a while. So it's really exciting that the Tor.com is bringing them back.
Yes, they're coming back May the 13th, folks. May the 13th. Emily and the Hollow World and Emily and the Sky World will be published. Tor.com for all of that. Or, of course, you can go to marthawells.com. And Queen Demon is coming out, right?
Yes, in October. I think it's October 10th or something. Yeah, and it's up for pre-order now, and it's a sequel to Witch King.
Very exciting. Can you give us just a tiny soupçon of Witch King, just the little pitch?
For Witch King or Queen Demon?
For Witch King, yeah.
Witch King.
Just get us started in the series.
It's a fantasy world where a small group of immortals are trying to recover from the mass invasion of their world by a genocidal colonial power. And there's two sections of the book, the one where they've driven them away and are trying now to keep the principles of their revolution intact, basically, and also solve one of the main characters trying to solve his own murder. And the past section where you see how they originally came together.
Amazing.
I'm terrible at pitching books.
Yeah, you're wonderful at writing them, which is
I just can't pitch them at all.
And of course, we alluded to this at the beginning, but Murderbot is getting a TV series, right?
Yes, it will be on. It's in post-production now. It will be on Apple Plus streaming sometime this summer. And if you want more details on the cast, see the cast and everything, you can look it up on, I think it's Deadline News. You can just get on there and search Murderbot, and they have 3 or 4 articles.
Yeah, I've shared that's it. Tag link, so you can find all the articles there about Murderbot. How has it been going from author to assistant producer? Are you
or consulting producer? Yeah, it's been really interesting. We've been working on it since 2021.
Wow.
And basically talking about it and how it would look, and looking at production art, and making decisions and stuff, and it's just been really, really cool. The production company is Depth of Field, and they really understood what the story was about and really committed to making it the best they could. And I think they absolutely did it. And I think the whole cast is wonderful. And I just love how it turned out so much.
Amazing. Very, very exciting. Now, I know you can't tell us more about it, but folks, do keep an eye on Deadline. I have been reliably informed that's where all the information will be available first. So that's deadline.com. And if you search tag Murderbot, you will find the news. So that kind of brings us to the end today. Do you have any parting words on factions for our aspiring and current writers, authors, and world builders?
I think again the important thing is point of view. Is the point of view of your main character and the point of view of the other characters, is remembering that everyone thinks they're right. And so that really realizing these that your antagonist characters and even your villain characters are going to have a point of view about what they're doing, and whether they're doing it enthusiastically or reluctantly or because they have to, they are going to have that point of view, and figuring that out will really help you make your characters feel more fleshed out and realistic.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any tips on really kind of embedding your factions and characters into the world around them?
Well, again, I get build them with the world. Again, like kind of, I know a lot of people like to have everything worked out in advance, and I really don't. I'm kind of an organic, like seat of the pants writer. And so for me, that's a really good way to do it because, again, like I was describing with Moon, you bring this character to a place. Well, what's going to happen here? Who's going to be upset about that? Who's going to be happy about it? That's where the seeds of the factions will show up.
Fantastic. Martha, thank you so very much for joining us today. You have been a fount of inspiration and knowledge.
Well, thank you so much. And I really enjoyed this conversation. It was astonishing how fast it went by. I felt like, well, we're already almost out of time. What,
There's nothing like nerding out with fellow world builders, authors about topics that we care about. Like that's
Yes.
what I have always enjoyed about this podcast is that we just get to nerd out for an hour and we can call it
Yeah.
work.
And it's so much fun.
And it's so much fun. Well, folks, the fun is not over yet because we are going on a raid. Our raid shout is Light Up the Forge, and we are raiding Ethnis Studio, who will be doing some World Anvil world building. So make sure you do not miss that. Just hang out in the chat, and the magic of Twitch will take you there. And if you are not on Twitch, if you're over on YouTube, go to www.worldanvil. Sorry, twitch.com/world anvil. Beg your pardon, I got my URLs and askew. And that will take you where you need to be. Folks, thank you so very much for joining us. I will see you all next week. And in the meantime, grab your hammer and go world build. Bye.